Have you ever laid in bed at night, eyes wide open, while your mind runs wild with thoughts you didn't invite? You replay old conversations, imagine scenarios that may never happen, and dive deep into the abyss of what-ifs. You want peace, but your thoughts are loud, relentless, and worst of all, they don't seem to stop. But why? Why do we think so much, so often, so uncontrollably? You might believe it's because you care deeply, that you're a thinker, a planner, a perfectionist. But what if I told you that overthinking isn't a strength, and it's not even entirely your fault? We live in a world that praises doing, fixing, analyzing, optimizing. From the moment we wake up, our minds are bombarded with choices, comparisons, and 1,000 mental tabs left open. Just like a cluttered web browser we forgot to close. Society rewards constant productivity, but it never taught us how to rest, how to pause, how to be. Somewhere along the way, we confused thinking with living. And that's the problem. You see, overthinking is not the result of having too many problems. It's the result of being too identified with your thoughts. You believe every thought has value, that each one must be entertained, challenged, solved. But not all thoughts are truth. Not all thoughts are yours, and most of them aren't even helpful. What we call thinking is often just noise, a protective shield the mind creates to avoid discomfort, uncertainty, and silence. Ironically, the very peace we seek becomes buried under the thoughts we keep piling on. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." But what happens when your mind becomes your prison? When your thoughts become chains instead of wings? That's where this journey begins. Because here's a secret the modern world doesn't often tell you. Peace isn't found by solving every problem. It's found when you realize you don't have to react to every thought. In this series, we'll explore the real reason your mind won't stop racing, and the ancient Buddhist wisdom that can help you finally step out of the storm. Not by escaping your thoughts, but by seeing through them. Not by suppressing your feelings, but by understanding where they come from and why they grip you so tightly. And no, this isn't about meditation cliches or forcing yourself to be positive. This is about something far deeper. It's about clarity, a kind of silence that doesn't ignore the world but sees through it. So if you're tired of the inner noise, if you're craving a life where your mind works with you, not against you, then stay with me. Because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see everything, including yourself. Let's begin. There's a quiet truth that waits beneath the noise of everyday life, a simple but profound realization that can change everything. This moment is all we ever truly have. Most people don't live here, though. Their minds drift to yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's uncertainties. They carry the weight of what was or the anxiety of what could be. But rarely do they rest in what is, this breath, this heartbeat, this now. Buddhist teachings point to this precise place, the present, as the only doorway to peace. And it isn't just philosophy, it's medicine for the restless mind. You see, the Buddha once asked a group of monks, "Where does suffering live?" And he answered, "Suffering lives in the craving for what isn't here. Wanting things to be different, holding on to what's already gone, or fearing what hasn't arrived. This is where pain takes root. But when you fully enter the present moment, when you allow yourself to simply be without resistance, you step out of the storm. You don't need to change anything, just notice, just breathe. Think about this. How often do you eat a meal without tasting it? Walk through your home without seeing it? Sit with someone you love without really being there? We live like ghosts, haunting the past or chasing the future. But life doesn't happen in the past. And the future is just a story we're telling ourselves. Life happens here. To live in the present is not to abandon responsibility. It's to become intimate with reality. It means you're no longer controlled by what you can't change. And the result, a profound lightness, like a weight being lifted that you didn't even know you were carrying. There's a Zen saying that captures it perfectly: when walking, walk; when eating, eat. Simple but revolutionary. Because most of us are always doing one thing while thinking about another. Multitasking may be useful for machines, but it's a prison for the human soul. And here's where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness isn't about trying to be calm or suppress emotions. It's about being aware, fully present, inhabiting your body, noticing your breath, the way the sunlight falls across the room, the tension in your jaw, the emotions passing like clouds through the sky. You don't need to stop your thoughts. You just need to stop following them. Let them rise. Let them fall. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. One elderly monk shared this insight with a student who was overwhelmed by regret. He said, "If your hands are full of yesterday, how will you hold today?" And in that lies the power of the present moment. It gives you your life back. Living in the present doesn't mean everything is perfect, but it means you're awake to what's actually happening, instead of being lost in illusion. It means you're no longer chasing happiness like it's somewhere else. You're letting joy arise from what's already here. Sometimes the present moment is uncomfortable. Sometimes it brings sadness or grief or uncertainty. But even then, if you stay, if you breathe into it, you'll find it's bearable. What's unbearable is the story we add to it. The what-ifs. The "this shouldn't be happening." The resistance. Eckhart Tolle once said, "Whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it." That single sentence contains lifetimes of spiritual practice. Because when you stop fighting reality, reality softens its grip. Right now, wherever you are, pause. Feel your feet on the floor. Feel the breath enter your body. Look around you, not with judgment, but with presence. Everything you need is already here. And when you realize that, you'll see what the Buddha meant when he said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." That's not just a quote. It's a liberation. And the more we learn to come back, again and again, to now, the more we begin to see that the present moment is not just a place of peace. It's a place of power, because only in the now can we choose. Only in the now can we love. Only in the now can we truly live. We spend so much of our lives grasping for certainty, grasping for outcomes, grasping for people, for things, for answers. But the more tightly we hold on, the more life seems to slip through our fingers, like trying to clutch water in a closed fist. The truth is, control is an illusion, and suffering is what happens when we refuse to accept that. Somewhere deep inside, we believe that if we just try hard enough, plan enough, worry enough, push enough, we can bend reality to our will. We believe that if we control everything around us, we'll finally feel safe, at peace, happy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. There are storms in life you simply can't stop. You can't control whether someone loves you back. You can't control the choices your adult children make. You can't control the economy, or your aging, or the past, or even the exact moment you'll take your last breath. And yet we fight these truths daily, with clenched jaws and restless minds. The Buddha once said, "Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, even so the wise are not affected by praise or blame." This is not just poetic, it's a compass for freedom. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. You shift your energy from resisting life to flowing with it. Think of a tree during strong wind. If it refuses to bend, it breaks. But if it sways with the storm, it survives, perhaps even stronger afterward. The practice of letting go is a deep act of wisdom. It starts by asking, what am I holding on to that is causing me pain? Is it resentment from an old betrayal? Is it the dream that never came true? Is it someone else's approval? Is it the version of your life you thought you'd be living by now? Pause. Breathe. You don't have to carry that anymore. In Zen Buddhism, we are reminded again and again, suffering arises when we crave for things to be other than what they are. When we resist what is. But when we surrender to the moment, when we say, "This is what's happening and I allow it to be," something miraculous happens. The storm inside begins to still. Here's a simple practice. The next time life throws you something unexpected, don't react right away. Don't try to fix it. Don't spiral into what-if scenarios. Just pause, breathe, and ask yourself, can I accept this moment exactly as it is? Sometimes that tiny act of acceptance opens the door to immense clarity. And even if you can't accept it fully, accept that you can't. That's still progress. Letting go also means trusting. Trusting that you can handle what life brings. Trusting that even in pain there is growth. Trusting that the universe doesn't make mistakes, it rearranges. Imagine you're holding a hot coal of regret in your hand. It's burning you, but you're afraid that if you drop it, you'll lose something important. But the truth is, you only lose the pain, so drop it. Let it fall. Free both your hand and your heart. As you begin to release what no longer serves you, you'll notice a lightness in your chest. You'll start to move through the world not as someone desperate to control, but as someone grounded in peace. You'll stop forcing and start flowing. You'll start responding instead of reacting. You'll speak less but with more power. You'll do less but with more impact. There's a saying in the Zen tradition, let go or be dragged. When we cling to the unchangeable, we're dragged through suffering. When we release, we're lifted by grace. And you know what's beautiful? Every time you let go of something heavy, you make space for something better. Let go of the past and receive the present. Let go of anger and receive compassion. Let go of control and receive freedom. This is not easy work, but it is sacred work. And it begins not with force, but with a whisper, I am willing to let this go. Because only by emptying our hands can we receive what life is truly offering. And when you do, when you finally let go, you'll discover something astonishing. That peace was never about controlling the storm. It was about learning how to be still within it. Have you ever stood in the middle of your home, your office, your thoughts, and felt suffocated, not by people or noise, but by things? By clutter, by demands, by endless choices. There is a quiet truth that often goes unnoticed in our pursuit of happiness. The less we carry, the more we feel free. And this isn't just about physical objects. This is about mental weight, emotional baggage, and the invisible burdens we agree to bear in the name of success or security. The Buddha once said, the root of suffering is attachment. Not just attachment to people or desires, but also to our possessions, identities, expectations, and the imagined need to constantly do more, have more, be more. Let's pause here. What if happiness isn't found in adding but in subtracting? What if peace doesn't come from possessing but from releasing? In Zen Buddhism, minimalism is not a trend. It is a spiritual path. Not the minimalist aesthetic that fills social media with white walls and clean desks, but the kind that clears the mind and soul. It's about simplifying your life so your heart has room to breathe again. A Zen master once asked a student, "What is the essence of Zen?" The student replied, "Simplify." There was no need for more words. So how do we simplify in a world that thrives on complexity? Start here. 1. Simplify your space. Look around you. Every item you own either supports your peace or disrupts it. Do your surroundings reflect your inner calm, or do they mirror your inner chaos? Take a small box. Fill it with things you haven't touched in months. Seal it. Put it away. If you don't remember what's inside in a month, donate it. You're not just letting go of objects, you're training your mind to let go of attachments. 2. Simplify your commitments. Every yes you say to others is a no you say to yourself. Are you doing things out of love or out of guilt, obligation, or habit? It's okay to say no. It's okay to rest. It's okay to protect your time like sacred ground. Because in truth, simplicity isn't laziness. It's clarity, and clarity is power. 3. Simplify your thoughts. Your mind doesn't need to hold on to every worry, every memory, every what if. Let go of mental clutter. Try this short practice. Sit down, breathe in, say silently, let. Breathe out, say silently, go. Let go. Do this for 1 minute. Then notice how your body softens, your shoulders drop, and your thoughts feel less like storms and more like passing clouds. 4. Simplify your goals. Modern life teaches us that we need a 5-year plan, a dream board, a bucket list, and 10 metrics to measure our success. But Zen whispers something else. Just be here. What if your only goal today was to drink tea slowly, to smile at someone with your whole being, to walk without rushing? This isn't mediocrity. This is mastery. Because when you give your full presence to one simple thing, you begin to master the art of life. And the more you master the present moment, the less you need from the future. A monk once said, "I have everything I need. A robe, a bowl, a roof over my head. The rest, it only distracts me from what truly matters." This might sound extreme, but the wisdom is universal. You don't need much to be happy, you just need enough. And what is enough? Enough to live, enough to breathe, enough to love without fear. Because happiness doesn't come when you finally get what you want. It comes when you no longer feel the need to want so much. That's the secret. A simpler life is not a lesser life. It is a deeper life, one where you walk lightly, where your heart is not entangled in needing more, where you can finally hear the silence beneath the noise. And in that silence, you find peace, you find truth, you find yourself. And now, as we continue walking this path together, let us turn gently toward a lesson that feels even more delicate, but no less essential: how to handle pain without running from it. How to meet suffering not with resistance, but with compassion. There's a strange comfort in knowing that nothing lasts forever. It might not feel like it at first, especially when you're holding onto someone you love, a success you've just achieved, or even a version of yourself you're finally proud of. We try to freeze these moments, grasping tightly like children clutching their favorite toy. But just like everything in this world, they slip away, sometimes gently, sometimes like a storm. Yet within that truth lies freedom. In Buddhist philosophy, this truth is called anicca, impermanence. It's not just a poetic idea, it's one of the 3 marks of existence. Everything, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, your possessions, your joys, and your sorrows, will eventually transform or disappear. Nothing stays the same. Nothing remains untouched by time. Think about this. That deep sadness you once thought would last forever, it didn't. The heartbreak that shattered you years ago, you survived it. The success that made you feel like you were on top of the world, it passed too. We often resist change because we want certainty. We crave something to rely on, to cling to. But what if certainty itself is the illusion? What if letting go of that craving is the key to peace? Imagine your life as a river. You can try to dam it up, to build walls around certain moments so they'll stay. But eventually, the water will rise. The current will push through. Time, experience, life itself will keep flowing. Trying to stop it only brings suffering. But when you surrender to that current, when you stop fighting what's constantly in motion, you float. You move with it. You see the beauty in each ripple instead of the fear of what lies downstream. And that's where real strength lies, not in holding on, but in adapting, evolving, and learning to love what is while it is. A Zen monk once shared a simple practice. Every morning he reminds himself, everything I love will change, everything I fear will pass, everything I am will transform. Not to be negative, but to live fully without illusion. When you embrace impermanence, small annoyances stop being such a big deal. The traffic jam, it will clear. The argument, forgotten in time. Even your own mood, up or down, is just a cloud passing across the sky of your awareness. But more than that, when you truly understand impermanence, you begin to love deeper. You realize each person you meet, each smile you share, each moment you experience is unrepeatable. You stop rushing. You pay attention. You give yourself to the present not because it's perfect, but because it's fleeting. And that makes it precious. Many people associate aging with loss, the loss of youth, energy, opportunity. But seen through the lens of impermanence, aging becomes a teacher. It strips away illusion. It reveals what truly matters. It teaches you that trying to stay young forever is just another form of suffering. Peace comes from letting go. So next time you find yourself resisting change, ask, what if this isn't the end? What if this is just transformation? A tree lets go of its leaves in autumn, not because it's dying, but because it's preparing for rebirth. You too are allowed to change, to shed, to begin again. Let impermanence guide your heart toward peace, not panic, toward gratitude, not grasping. And now, as we flow from this deep truth about change, let's explore something equally profound yet often misunderstood. A path that doesn't just accept impermanence, but celebrates it through conscious intention. What if happiness isn't found in more, but in less? Let's step into that clarity. Sometimes the loudest voice we hear is not from the world outside, but the one inside our own head. That voice that says, "You're not good enough," or "What if this all goes wrong?" It whispers, it nags, it judges. And too often we believe it, we become it. We assume that because we think something, it must be true. But here's a radical, life-changing truth rooted deep in Buddhist wisdom. You are not your thoughts. Yes, you heard that right. The thoughts in your mind are like clouds in the sky. They come, they go. Some are dark and heavy, others light and harmless. But the sky itself, it remains untouched, pure, limitless. Just like that sky, your true nature is not defined by the passing clouds of thought. And when you finally realize that, it's like stepping out of a mental prison you didn't even know you were in. Let's pause for a second. How often do you find yourself lost in thought, ruminating about the past, worrying about a future that hasn't happened yet, planning, judging, comparing, regretting? These are the habitual loops of the mind, thought patterns that play over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. Now imagine this. Instead of being swept away by every anxious thought or emotional wave, you learn to just watch them. Like leaves floating down a stream. You don't have to chase them. You don't have to fight them. You just observe. This is the practice of mindfulness. It's not about stopping your thoughts. It's about no longer identifying with them. In the Zen tradition, this is referred to as the mind watching the mind. A moment of awareness where you notice, a thought just passed. And in that moment, you are no longer the thought but the one who sees it. Let's take an example. Imagine you're walking through a crowded market. So many noises, smells, people brushing past you. It's chaotic. But then you step onto a quiet rooftop and look down. From that higher place, everything seems different. You see the same chaos, but you're no longer in it. That rooftop, that's your awareness. That's what happens when you rise above your thoughts, when you realize, this sadness, this anger, this anxiety, it's not me. It's just passing through. And when you stop clinging to your thoughts, you begin to taste freedom. Because here's the secret. Most suffering doesn't come from what happens to us. It comes from how we interpret it in our minds. Someone cuts you off in traffic. It's not the event, but the story you tell yourself afterward. They disrespected me. People are so rude. Why does this always happen to me? That internal narrative becomes the suffering. But when you catch the story in the moment, when you recognize, oh, that's just my mind spiraling again, you can let go. You don't feed it, you don't believe it, and it dissolves like fog in the morning sun. In Buddhist teachings, there's a word for this state of awareness, sati, which means presence, attention, mindfulness. It's like having a candle in a dark room. Suddenly, you see things clearly. And once you see clearly, you no longer get caught in illusions. Now, here's something truly empowering. You don't have to fight your negative thoughts. You don't have to argue with your inner critic. All you have to do is notice, with gentleness, with curiosity, and let it pass. Because the moment you recognize a thought, you are no longer trapped by it. That's the power of awareness. And here's something even more beautiful. When you disidentify from your thoughts, you begin to connect with something deeper, your true self. Not the self that worries about bills or regrets old mistakes. Not the self that compares your life to others on social media. But the calm, observing presence that has always been there. The part of you that watches a sunset and feels at peace for no reason. The part that listens to silence and feels whole. That is who you truly are. And when you live from that place, from the still center within, you begin to move through life with a sense of grace. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop chasing happiness and start embodying it. You become unshakable. As the Buddha once said, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. But now you know you don't have to become every thought. You can choose. You can observe. You can let go. So the next time your mind starts spiraling with worries, judgments, or fears, take a breath. Return to the rooftop. Become the watcher. Because you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. And that realization, that's the gateway to true peace. Let's now explore something even deeper. Once you stop identifying with your thoughts, another realization gently emerges, something subtle yet profoundly liberating. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. And that brings us to a truth that Zen Buddhism holds at its very core. When life feels chaotic, uncertain, or overwhelming, what is the one thing that always remains with you, unshaken, ever-present, and quietly faithful? Your breath. You don't need to believe in anything mystical. You don't need to seek peace outside. You've had the key all along, every inhale, every exhale. It's the soft whisper beneath the noise of your thoughts. It's the metronome of your existence. And in Buddhist wisdom, the breath isn't just a biological rhythm. It's your most accessible gateway to mindfulness, stillness, and clarity. Imagine a stormy ocean, waves crashing, winds howling, the sky darkened with uncertainty. That's your mind when thoughts, emotions, and external chaos take over. Now picture a ship caught in this storm. If the ship isn't anchored, it will drift wherever the tide pulls it. But if it's firmly anchored, it holds steady, grounded, unmoved by the tempests around. That anchor, right now, in this very moment, is your breath. You might be wondering, how can something as ordinary as breathing change the way I live? Because in the present moment, your breath is the only thing that is real. The past, gone, the future, not here yet, but your breath, this breath is happening now. And it's always been here waiting for you to notice it, to return home. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh often said, "Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor." When your mind wanders, when fear starts creeping in, when regret tries to poison your heart or anxiety rises like a tide, return to your breath. Let it draw you out of the shadows and into the still light of the now. Take a moment. Breathe in. Feel the air entering your nostrils. Feel your chest rise, your belly expand. Breathe out. Feel your body soften, your thoughts slow, your heart settle. This is not passive. It's not escapism. On the contrary, it's a revolutionary act of returning to yourself. In a world that constantly tries to pull you in every direction, returning to your breath is an act of rebellion. It's saying, I choose to be here now. The Buddha taught that awareness of breathing is the direct path to liberation. Why? Because the breath doesn't lie, it's always truthful. It brings you face to face with how you are right now. Anxious, it shows. Calm, it shows. Angry, it shows. But most beautifully, it doesn't judge you. It just is. That's the magic of breath. It doesn't require perfection. You don't have to fix your mind. You just have to observe. Let your breath come and go. Let it guide your attention. Mindfulness begins here, not in theory, not in books, but in the raw experience of this very breath. If you truly observe one breath with full awareness, you're already meditating. You're already living in presence. You're already free. And if you lose it, that's okay. Begin again. Always begin again. That's the rhythm of the breath. The rhythm of life. Rise, fall, start again. So the next time you feel lost, don't rush to fix, to do, to react. Just breathe. Because in that pause, you'll find space. And in that space, you'll remember, you are not the storm. You are the calm beneath it. Now let's continue our journey toward deeper clarity as we explore one of the most misunderstood truths in all of Buddhism. A truth that will forever change the way you see yourself, your identity, and your suffering. So now let's take a breath. No need to rush. No need to chase. You've arrived exactly where you need to be. Not at the end, but at the heart of it all. This journey we've walked together, from learning to live in the present, to letting go of what we can't control, from embracing impermanence, simplifying life, quieting the mind, and anchoring in the breath, has not been a journey outward, but a journey inward. A return. You were never missing anything. You were never broken. You didn't need fixing. You simply needed to remember. The peace you've been searching for through possessions, relationships, accomplishments, even spiritual achievements, has always lived quietly within you. Like a still lake beneath the ripples. Like the sky behind the clouds. When you pause, when you truly pause and allow yourself to sit with what is, not pushing, not resisting, you'll begin to notice something extraordinary. There's a stillness that does not depend on circumstances, a calm that remains even when the world shakes, a deep okayness, even when life is not okay. That's your true nature. The Buddha didn't teach us to escape life. He showed us how to meet it fully, honestly, gently, without clinging or running. To open our hearts to the rawness of this human experience and find freedom in the middle of it all. Not someday, not when things are better, but here. Now, in this breath, peace is not a reward for being perfect. It is your birthright. You don't have to chase it anymore. You only have to return to yourself. And when you forget, as we all do, may you come back to your breath. May you come back to the present. May you come back home. If something in these words stirred a quiet knowing in your soul, then this is your place. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not because we chase followers, but because we walk this path together. Each video is a lantern for your inner journey. Each teaching is a mirror reflecting your own wisdom. So stay close, stay mindful, and remember, the peace you seek has never left you. It breathes with you. Right here, right now.